St. Michael's Church has stood empty for years in the small town of Millbrook. Every morning, Thomas Wheeler, a quiet man of 73, walks up its crumbling steps with his cleaning supplies. He spent the last 3 years trying to bring life back to this forgotten place, working alone among the dusty pews and silent halls. Today started like any other day, until a soft cry echoed from the bell tower. What Thomas found there would change not only his life, but the life of the richest woman in the country. A tiny baby, wrapped in silk, wearing a necklace worth millions. Who would leave their child in an abandoned church? And why does this necklace look so familiar? 5 hours earlier, Thomas Wheeler had woken in darkness. It wasn't insomnia, hadn't been for years. His body simply knew its purpose, like the brass gears of the antique clock in his hallway that turned with quiet precision. 4:30 a.m., same as every morning. He reached first for the bronze watch on his nightstand, its face gleaming softly in the pre-dawn gloom. Martha had given it to him on their 40th anniversary, just 6 months before the cancer took her. "For the man who always has time for others," the inscription read. Some mornings he traced those words with trembling fingers, but not today. Today, the watch felt warm in his palm, almost alive. His modest bedroom held the essentials: a neatly made twin bed, a solid oak dresser he'd crafted himself 30 years ago, and a single framed photograph, him and Martha outside their first apartment in 73. She'd worn yellow that day, bright as sunshine against Chicago's gray buildings. The picture had faded, but her smile hadn't dimmed. Thomas dressed methodically, pressed khakis, a clean white shirt, comfortable walking shoes. His movements were practiced, efficient. Years of precision craftsmanship had taught him the value of routine. In the bathroom mirror, he straightened his collar, combed his silver hair, still thick, though now more white than grey. Martha used to tease him about that hair, said he'd been born distinguished. The kitchen was spotless, everything in its place. He'd cleaned it last night, like he did every night. The coffee maker hummed to life at his touch, programmed to start brewing the moment he flipped its switch. While it worked, he packed his cleaning supplies, microfiber cloths, gentle cleansers for wood and stone, cotton swabs for detailed work. Each item had its place in his old leather tool bag, the same one he'd used when crafting custom jewelry for Chicago's finest families. That had been another life, before the arthritis made fine detail work impossible, before Martha's illness drained their savings, before they'd moved to Millbrook for a simpler life. He didn't regret it. The church needed him now, like his customers had needed him then. The coffee was ready. Thomas poured it into his thermos. Steel, reliable, practical. Through his kitchen window, he could see the first hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. Right on schedule. His small house sat on Cedar Street, 3 blocks from St. Michael's. The walk took exactly 12 minutes at his pace, past darkened storefronts and silent homes. The town would wake soon, but these moments belonged to him alone. His footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk, accompanied only by the occasional call of an early bird. The church's spire appeared first, a darker shape against the lightening sky. Thomas paused at the bottom of the steps, as he did every morning, and looked up at the weathered stone facade. Martha had loved this church. "It just needs someone to care," she'd said near the end. "Like you cared for all those beautiful things you made." So he came every day and cared for it. The heavy key turned smoothly in the lock. He'd cleaned and oiled the mechanism himself. Inside, the air was cool and still, heavy with history. Thomas set his bag down carefully, removed his bronze watch, and placed it in the side pocket where it would be safe. Then he reached for his first cleaning cloth of the day, ready to begin his work. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in jewel tones. Soon, the dust motes would dance in those beams. But for now, in these quiet moments before sunrise, St. Michael's was his and his alone, or so he thought, until the cry echoed down from the bell tower, changing everything. The cry came again, fainter this time. Thomas stood frozen, his cleaning cloth suspended in mid-air. In 36 months of caring for St. Michael's, he'd heard plenty of sounds, creaking wood, settling stone, pigeons in the rafters. But never this, never a sound so unmistakably human. He set down his cloth and listened. The church's acoustics played tricks sometimes, bouncing sounds from unexpected angles. But there it was again, definitely from above, the steep, narrow stairs to the bell tower had been roped off for years, deemed unsafe by the building inspector. Thomas had cleaned them anyway, though he'd never ventured all the way up. His footsteps echoed as he crossed the nave. The rope barrier came down easily. He'd been maintaining that too, just in case. The first step creaked under his weight, but held firm. He'd reinforced it himself last summer, along with the others. Slowly, steadily, he began to climb. Dust swirled in the shaft of morning light, piercing through the tower's single window. The crying grew louder, clearer. A baby's cry, without question now. Thomas's heart pounded against his ribs as he reached the top landing. There, nestled in a makeshift bed of old choir robes, lay a tiny bundle wrapped in silk. The fabric was expensive. His years handling fine materials told him that much, and embroidered with delicate initials, EVM. The baby inside couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, with skin like warm copper and a full head of dark curls. "Hello, little one," Thomas whispered, reaching down with trembling hands. The infant's cries softened at his touch. As he lifted the bundle, something glinted in the morning light. A necklace, wrapped carefully around the silk blanket's corner, caught the sun and scattered it like stars. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He knew this necklace. Everyone in the jewelry business knew this necklace. The moonstone pendant, a flawless blue diamond surrounded by perfect white stones, set in platinum so pure it seemed to glow. He'd read about its creation, studied its design. It had been commissioned by Richard Morgan for his wife Elena's 25th birthday, just months before his death. The baby squirmed in his arms, drawing his attention back to more immediate concerns. He needed help. This was far beyond his expertise. With one arm cradling the infant, he pulled out his old flip phone and dialed 911. "Emergency services. What's your situation? I'm at St. Michael's Church on Cedar Street. His voice caught. "I found a baby in the bell tower." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. Police cars arrived first, their lights flashing against the stained glass. Officer Sarah Martinez was first through the door, her dark eyes taking in everything. At once, "Mr. Wheeler?" She holstered her weapon as she approached. "I'm Officer Martinez. Is the baby okay?" Thomas nodded, still cradling the infant. "Seems to be. Hungry, probably. And needing a change." Sarah Martinez was young for a police officer, maybe 30, but she moved with quiet confidence. She spoke into her radio, requesting medical support, then turned back to Thomas. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. He hesitated, surprising himself with his reluctance to let go. "The necklace," he said. "You should know about the necklace." Officer Martinez's expression shifted as she examined the pendant. "Is this what I think it is?" "The moonstone pendant, yes, worth millions. And those initials on the blanket, EVM. Elena Valentina Morgan, the billionaire." Sarah's professional demeanor cracked slightly. This just got complicated. The baby chose that moment to start crying again. Thomas automatically began swaying, a motion he remembered from long ago nights with his own children. The infant settled almost immediately. "You're good with babies?" Sarah observed, making notes in her small pad. "Had 3 of my own, all grown now, scattered across the country." He didn't add that they rarely called anymore. "What happens next?" "We'll need statements, photographs. Child services will have to be notified." She paused, watching him with the baby. "But first, let's get this little one checked out. Would you be willing to come to the station? We'll need a full statement. And honestly," she smiled slightly, You seem to have the magic touch." As if on cue, the baby yawned and snuggled closer to Thomas's chest. Through the tower window, he could see news vans already beginning to arrive. By noon, this quiet morning would become a circus. But for now, in the peace of the bell tower, Thomas Wheeler held a miracle in his arms and wondered how one small life could weigh so much. The police station in Millbrook occupied a small brick building downtown, its walls lined with faded photographs of past sheriffs. Thomas sat in a worn chair, the baby still in his arms, while Officer Martinez made calls. She'd convinced the social worker to delay taking the infant until they understood more about the situation. A female officer had produced diapers and formula from somewhere. Now, freshly changed and fed, the baby slept peacefully against Thomas's chest. The moonstone pendant lay on the desk before him, gleaming under fluorescent lights. "Tell me about—" "The necklace," Sarah said, returning with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one near Thomas, careful not to wake the baby. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his craftsman's eyes studying the piece. "It was commissioned in 1998. Richard Morgan wanted something unique for his wife Elena's 25th birthday. The center stone is a natural blue diamond, 17 carats, flawless. The surrounding diamonds are colorless, D-grade. The setting—" He paused, remembering. The setting was revolutionary for its time. Tension-mounted stones in platinum, but with a hidden support structure that makes it virtually indestructible. "You know a lot about it." "Every jeweler does. It was featured in every trade magazine. I was working in Chicago then, had my own shop on Michigan Avenue. We all studied it, tried to understand how they'd achieved that floating effect with the stones." He smiled faintly. "I even met Richard Morgan once at a trade show. He was passionate about jewelry design, understood the artistry of it, not just the value." Sarah made notes. "And Elena Morgan? Did you ever meet her?" "No. After Richard died, she became reclusive. The papers said she wore the necklace to his funeral and never again in public." He touched the pendant gently. "It's been missing for 25 years, along with their daughter." Sarah's pen stopped moving. "Their daughter, Catherine Morgan, disappeared the same night as the necklace, just after her 16th birthday. The papers called it a kidnapping, but no ransom demand ever came. Elena Morgan offered a reward, $50 million. It's still unclaimed." The baby stirred, making small sounds in sleep. Thomas adjusted his hold automatically, and the infant settled. "Mr. Wheeler," Sarah said carefully, "are you suggesting this baby might be connected to Catherine Morgan's disappearance? The initials on the blanket, EVM Elena Valentina Morgan. The necklace that's been missing for 25 years, and now a baby left in a church." He trailed off, remembering something else. The timing might be right. Catherine would be around 41 now. Sarah stood abruptly. "I need to make some calls. Higher up the chain." She hesitated. "Would you be willing to stay with the baby? A bit longer, until we sort this out?" Thomas looked down at the sleeping infant. Such a tiny thing, to be at the center of such a mystery. "Of course," he said softly. "I'll stay as long as needed." After Sarah left, Thomas studied the necklace more closely. The craftsmanship was even more impressive than the magazines had suggested. The platinum seemed to flow like liquid metal around the stones, each angle calculated to maximize the play of light. This wasn't just jewelry, it was art. He remembered the day he'd read about Richard Morgan's death, just months after commissioning the piece. A car accident, they'd said, but there had been rumors. Elena Morgan had withdrawn from public life, completely afterward, running her husband's technology empire from behind closed doors. When Catherine disappeared, the press had camped outside the Morgan estate for weeks, but Elena never appeared. The baby made a small sound, and Thomas realized. He'd been humming an old lullaby he used to sing to his own children. Some skills never fade, he thought, even after decades of disuse. Through the station's windows, he could see more media arriving. Soon, this quiet town would be overrun with reporters, all chasing the story of the billionaire's necklace. But for now, in this moment, Thomas Wheeler simply held a sleeping baby and wondered what other secrets St. Michael's Church might be keeping. The sun was setting by the time Child Services made their decision. Temporary emergency placement, the social worker had said, eyeing Thomas's spotless house. Just until we sort this out. She'd left him with supplies, instructions, and a promise to return first thing tomorrow. Now Thomas stood in his living room holding a sleeping baby and a crumpled note found tucked in the silk blanket. The paper was damaged, water-stained, but a few words remained legible. Protect her, like you protected years ago. The rest was lost to water damage. A knock at the door startled him. Carmen Rodriguez, his next-door neighbor, stood on his porch with a covered casserole dish. At 68, she'd been a pediatric nurse for 40 years before retiring. "Sarah Martinez called me," she said, bustling in. "Said you might need some help." She set down the casserole and held out her arms. "Let me see this little angel. While you eat something." Thomas hesitated before carefully transferring the baby. "I don't know her name," he admitted. Carmen adjusted the infant with practiced ease. "Then we'll have to call her something. How about Hope? Found in a church, bringing all this excitement to our quiet town. Seems fitting." The baby opened, her eyes revealing deep brown irises that seemed too wise for her age. Carmen smiled. "See? She likes it." While Thomas ate his first meal since breakfast, Carmen explained the basics of infant care. "You'll need to feed her every few hours, even through the night. Watch her neck, always support it, and trust your instincts. Babies sense fear and tension." "What if I make a mistake?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with worry. Carmen's expression softened. "You raised 3 children, didn't you? And look, how well they turned out." She tactfully didn't mention that his own children rarely visited. "Besides, I'm right next door. We'll figure this out together." As if to emphasize the challenge ahead, Hope began to cry. Carmen showed Thomas how to prepare a bottle, testing the temperature on his wrist. Not too hot, not too cold. Babies are like fine jewelry. They require attention to detail. The comparison made Thomas smile. He took Hope back, cradling her, close as she accepted the bottle. Her tiny hand wrapped around his finger, and something in his chest tightened. "You're a natural," Carmen observed. She began unpacking the baby supplies, organizing them with military precision. "But you'll need help. The media will be all over this story by morning." She was right. Already, reporters were gathering at the end of his street, held back by Millbrook's small police force. The moonstone pendant's reappearance would draw even more attention once the news broke. "What am I getting myself into, Carmen?" His neighbor paused in her organizing. "Something important, I think. God doesn't place these burdens on us by accident." She touched the cross at her neck. "That baby was left in your church, with that necklace, for a reason." Hope finished her bottle, and Carmen showed Thomas how to burp her. As he patted the tiny back, he thought about the partial note, about Elena Morgan's missing daughter, about all the threads of mystery woven into this. "Single day. Get some sleep while you can," Carmen advised, heading for the door. "She'll be up again in a few hours. I'll come by in the morning to help." She hesitated. "And Thomas, whatever happens next, you're not alone in this." After she left, Thomas settled into his armchair, Hope sleeping peacefully against his chest. Outside, camera flashes occasionally lit up the night as reporters tried to catch a glimpse through his windows. But inside, in the quiet of his living room, time seemed to stand still. The bronze watch on his wrist ticked steadily. Martha would have loved this, he thought. She always said the house was too quiet. Now, holding this mysterious child as night deepened around them, Thomas Wheeler whispered a prayer of thanks to whatever force had led him up those bell tower stairs this morning. By morning, the story had exploded. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, Hope asleep in a borrowed bassinet beside him, watching Carmen spread out old newspaper clippings she'd kept from 25 years ago. Her late husband had been obsessed with the Morgan case, collecting every article he could find. "Here," Carmen said, smoothing out a yellowed page from the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Tech Iris Vanishes, $50 million Reward Offered." Below it, a photograph showed 16-year-old Catherine Morgan at her last public appearance, wearing the moonstone pendant at a charity gala. Thomas leaned closer. Something about the girl's eyes. He glanced at Hope, then back at the photograph. The same deep brown, wise beyond their years. "There's more," Carmen continued, pulling out another clipping. "This one's from just after Richard Morgan's death." The article detailed the suspicious circumstances surrounding the car accident, brake lines cut, evidence of tampering, but nothing was ever proven. Officer Martinez arrived as they were studying the articles, carrying a thick file. "Morning," she said, accepting a cup of coffee from Carmen. "How's our little celebrity?" "Just fed and changed," Thomas replied. "Any news?" Sarah opened her file. "Elena Morgan's people contacted us last night. She's flying in today." She hesitated. "There's something else you should see." She pulled out a photograph, Catherine Morgan's last school picture. "Look at her neck." Thomas squinted at the image. Behind the moonstone pendant, barely visible, was a thin silver chain with a small medallion. His hands began to shake. "You recognize it?" Sarah asked quietly. "I made it," Thomas whispered. "A custom piece 26 years ago for Richard Morgan. He said it was for his daughter's confirmation." Carmen and Sarah exchanged glances. "Thomas," Carmen said gently, "what exactly did you make?" "A silver medallion, hand-engraved with St. Michael on one side and an inscription on the other, protected by angels, guided by love." He closed his eyes, remembering. Richard was very specific about the design. Said his wife's family had a tradition of giving religious medals for confirmation. Sarah pulled out another photo, a close-up of the medallion around Catherine's neck. It was the same piece. "There's more," Sarah said. "We found this in the church records." She produced a yellowed certificate. Catherine Morgan was confirmed at St. Michael's Church. Not this one, the original St. Michael's in Chicago. But look who signed as one of the witnesses. Thomas didn't need to look. "Martha Wheeler," he said softly. "My wife. She was the church secretary there before we moved." Hope stirred in her bassinet, making small sounds that Thomas already recognized as her pre-crying warm-up. He lifted her before the tears could start, and she settled immediately against his shoulder. "So we have multiple connections," Sarah summarized. "The necklace you recognized, the medallion you made, your wife's connection to the Morgan family through the church, and now this baby, left in another St. Michael's, wearing the long-lost moonstone pendant. It's not coincidence," Carmen declared. "Someone chose this church, chose Thomas very specifically." Thomas barely heard them. He was looking at Hope's face, comparing it to Catherine's photograph. The same eyes, the same delicate chin. "You think," he started. "We think Hope might be Catherine Morgan's daughter," Sarah confirmed, "which would make her Eleanor Morgan's granddaughter. DNA tests are already being processed." A sharp knock at the door made them all jump. Standing on Thomas's porch was a tall woman in an impeccable suit. "Mr. Wheeler," her voice was clipped, professional, "Ms. Morgan's car will be here in 10 minutes. She'd like to meet you and the baby at St. Michael's Church. She feels it would be appropriate." Thomas looked down at Hope, then at the scattered newspaper clippings showing the face of the young girl who might be her mother. "Yes," he said finally. "I suppose it would be." The woman nodded and withdrew. Thomas could see the black town. Car idling at the end of his driveway, its tinted windows hiding more security personnel. "Well," Carmen said, gathering up the clippings, "it seems the next chapter of this story is about to begin." She squeezed Thomas's arm. "Want me to come with you?" Thomas shook his head. "No, but thank you." He looked down at Hope, who gazed, back with those haunting brown eyes. "I think this is something I need to do alone." The walk to St. Michael's felt longer than usual. Thomas carried Hope in a borrowed baby sling, her warmth pressed against his chest. He'd taken extra care with his appearance this morning. Pressed shirt, good jacket, his best shoes polished. To a shine. Old habits from his jewelry days, always looked professional when meeting important clients. But Elena Morgan wasn't just another wealthy client. She was a woman who had lost everything: husband, daughter, and a quarter-century of time. Now here he was, carrying what might be her only grandchild toward their first meeting. He paused in his workshop before leaving, gathering tools he hadn't touched in years. His hands moved with surprising sureness as he shaped a small piece. Of maple wood, muscle memory taking over, a simple rattle emerged, smooth, safe, perfect for tiny hands. "Your first toy," he told Hope, tucking it into his pocket. "Every child should have something made just for them." The church steps were crowded with reporters held back by police barriers. Officer Martinez waited at the top, managing crowd control. She nodded as Thomas approached. "She's inside," Sarah said quietly. "Been here 20 minutes, just sitting in the front pew." Thomas adjusted Hope's sling. "How does she seem?" "Composed." "Very composed." Sarah hesitated, almost too composed. "If you know what I mean." He did. He'd seen that kind of composure before, in Martha during her final months. The careful control of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. Inside, the church was unusually clean. The morning light streamed through stained glass, creating pools of color on the worn stone floor. A solitary figure sat in the front pew, straight-backed and still. Elena Morgan was smaller than he'd expected. News photos always showed her as a commanding presence, but the woman before him seemed almost delicate. Her hair was silver now, elegantly styled, and she wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than his house. She didn't turn as he approached, though he knew she must have heard his footsteps. Hope chose that moment to make a small cooing sound, and Elena's shoulders tensed. "Miss Morgan," Thomas said softly. "I'm Thomas Wheeler." Now she did turn, and he saw her face properly, for the first time. The years had been both kind and cruel. She was still beautiful, but grief had left its marks in the fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her gaze went immediately to Hope. "May I?" "Of course." Thomas carefully lifted Hope from the sling. The baby was awake, looking around with her usual solemn curiosity. Elena's hands shook as she reached out, but her hold was sure as she took the baby. Hope studied this new face with intense concentration, then did something Thomas had never seen before. She smiled. Elena's careful composure cracked. A single tear rolled down her cheek as she touched Hope's dark curls. "Catherine's eyes," she whispered. "Exactly, Catherine's eyes." Thomas sat beside her, giving her space, but staying close. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden rattle. "I made this for her this morning." Eleanor looked at the simple toy, then at him with new understanding. "You're the jeweler, the one who made Catherine's confirmation medallion." "Yes, though my hands aren't as steady as they once were. But steady enough for this." She touched the smooth wood. "Richard would have appreciated this. He always said, 'The greatest gifts were the ones made with love.'" She paused. "Did you know him well?" "Only briefly. But he was kind to me at a time when many wealthy clients weren't. He understood craftsmanship, respected the work." Hope grabbed at the rattle, and Eleanor let her take it. The baby immediately put it in her mouth, making Eleanor laugh softly. Catherine did the same thing. Everything went straight to her mouth. The sound of her laughter echoed in the quiet church, and Thomas saw Sarah discreetly wipe her eyes from her position by the door. Even the morning light seemed warmer somehow. "Mr. Wheeler," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice serious again. "I need to tell you something about Catherine, about why—" She looked down at Hope, who was still happily gumming the rattle. "About why all of this happened." Elena opened her locket, a simple gold piece that seemed modest compared to the moonstone pendant. Inside was a photo of Catherine at 16, taken just days before her disappearance. She held it beside Hope's face, and the resemblance was undeniable. "Richard's death wasn't an accident," Elena said quietly, still holding Hope close. He discovered something in his company, corruption at the highest levels, board members selling technology to foreign powers, weapons systems being developed without oversight. She stroked Hope's cheek as the baby drifted to sleep. He was going to expose everything. Thomas remembered the news reports about the car accident. The brake lines were just the beginning. They tried to make it look random, but I knew. Eleanor's voice hardened. Catherine knew too. She found her father's evidence files, hidden. In his study, she was so much like him, brilliant, methodical, unable to ignore injustice. She paused, gathering strength. The night she disappeared, she left me a note, said she was going to finish what her father started. She took the necklace, Richard's last gift to me, as proof she was serious. A bitter smile crossed her face. She knew I'd never believe she'd run away without it. Did you look for her? For years, used every resource I had, but Catherine was clever. She'd learned from her father's mistakes, knew how to disappear. Completely. Elena touched the locket. The last trace we found was in South America, 3 years after she vanished. Then nothing. Hope stirred, and Elena instinctively rocked her. The movement seemed to unlock more memories. I rebuilt the company, removed every person Richard had suspected. It took 20 years, but I cleaned house completely, made the changes he'd wanted. She looked up at the church's vaulted ceiling. I thought maybe then Catherine would come home, but by then the trail was cold. And now? Thomas asked gently. Elena withdrew an envelope from her purse, handling it like it might shatter. This arrived at my office last week. No return address, no DNA traces, no identifiable postmark. She handed it to Thomas. Inside was a single photograph. Catherine, older but unmistakable, holding a newborn baby. On the back, 3 words. St. Michael's, soon. She's alive, Thomas said, studying the photo, and still in hiding. Eleanor's voice cracked. Whatever she uncovered must be bigger than what Richard found. She's protecting her daughter the only way she knows how, by keeping her distance. Thomas looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully despite the weight of history surrounding her. She chose this place deliberately, the connection to your family, to Martha, to me, a place where Hope would be safe, with people who had touched our lives before. Elena straightened, decision visible in her posture. Which is why I have a proposal for you, Mr. Wheeler. From outside came the sound of more vehicles arriving, cameras clicking, reporters calling questions. But inside St. Michael's, time seemed suspended as Elena Morgan turned to face Thomas fully. I want to restore this church, she said, make it a true sanctuary again. And I want you to help me raise hope, here where Catherine felt safe enough to leave her. She touched the wooden rattle. You make beautiful things, Mr. Wheeler, not just jewelry or toys, but connections, trust. Catherine saw that. Thomas looked at the sleeping baby, at the sunlight painting the ancient stones, at this powerful woman offering him a chance to be part of something larger than himself. Martha always said this place just needed someone to care, he said finally. Maybe it needs more than one someone. Elena's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Then we understand each other. She stood carefully, still holding Hope. Shall we face the cameras together, show them that Hope has both a grandmother and a grandfather now? Thomas rose, feeling stronger than he had in years. Yes, he said simply, I believe we shall. The media frenzy that followed their announcement was intense but mercifully brief. Elena's PR team managed the narrative expertly. Beloved church caretaker and grieving grandmother unite to care for mysterious baby. The headlines wrote themselves. A week later, Thomas stood in St. Michael's basement, holding a flashlight while Officer Martinez examined the old church registry. They'd discovered it that morning, hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. A record of every confirmation, wedding and baptism, performed in both the Chicago church and its sister parish in Millbrook. Look at this, Sarah said, carefully turning brittle pages. There's a pattern. She pointed to entries dating back 40 years. The Chicago St. Michael's wasn't just a church, it was a way station. Thomas leaned closer, scattered through. The normal church records were coded entries, names that didn't match their photographs, dates that seemed oddly specific. A sanctuary, he murmured, for people running from something or someone. Sarah pulled out her notebook. I cross-referenced some of these names. They all disappeared from official records after their confirmations here, resurfaced years later under different identities. Martha never mentioned she couldn't. Look, Sarah indicated a tiny symbol next to certain entries. A miniature. Angel barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Your wife was part of it. She was a guardian. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Martha had always been involved in church activities, staying late to help with paperwork. He'd never questioned it. There's more, Sarah continued. The original St. Michael's in Chicago burned down mysteriously in 1999, just after Catherine disappeared. All records were supposedly destroyed. She patted the registry, except this copy, which is why Catherine sent Hope here. Thomas realized. She knew about the network, knew Martha had been involved, and knew you'd been connected to her family before, through the medallion. Sarah closed the registry carefully. Question is, who else knows about this place? As if in answer, Elena appeared at the basement stairs. I think it's time I showed you something, she said, holding up an old key. Richard didn't just commission that medallion from you, Thomas. He had you make 12 of them. Together they followed Elena to her car, where her security team handed her a small steel case. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay 11 silver medallions, identical to the one Thomas had made for Catherine. The Guardians, Elena explained. 12 people Richard trusted, each responsible for a different safe house. Churches, mostly. Places where people in danger could disappear and restart their lives. Like witness protection, but unofficial, Sarah added. Exactly. When Richard discovered the corruption in his company, he didn't just stumble onto weapons sales. He found a human trafficking network, using corporate resources to move people against their will. Elena's face hardened. The same people who killed him had connections everywhere, law enforcement, government, even legitimate witness protection programs. So he created his own network, Thomas said, with the help of trusted clergy and church workers. Like Martha, Elena touched one of the medallions. Each guardian wore one, a symbol of their commitment and a way for those seeking help to identify them. Sarah examined the medallions. Catherine must have used this network to disappear, and now she's used it to protect Hope. Elena looked at Thomas. When you made these, Richard told you they were for a confirmation class, a special group of 12 students. Thomas nodded, memory stirring. He was very specific about the design. St. Michael on one side, protected by angels, guided by love on the other. Elena finished. It wasn't just a confirmation message. It was a promise to those seeking sanctuary. Hope's cry echoed from upstairs, where Carmen was watching her. Thomas instinctively moved toward the sound, but Elena caught his arm. Wait, there's one more thing you need to see. She opened her locket again, but this time removed a tiny folded paper hidden behind the photograph. This came with the picture of Catherine and Hope. Thomas unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was different from the water-damaged note found with Hope, but the message was clear. The work isn't finished. They're still operating, still hurting people. Hope needs protection while I complete what Dad started. Keep her safe. Trust the Guardians. Kay. So it's not over, Sarah said quietly. Elena shook her head. No. And now we're all part of it. The question is, are you ready for what that means? Thomas thought of Martha, quietly helping people escape danger all those years, of Catherine, sacrificing everything to finish her father's work, of Hope, sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware of the legacy she carried. Yes, he said firmly, I believe we are. The legal guardian papers sat unsigned on Thomas's kitchen table. Dawn light filtered through the windows, catching the official seals and turning them to gold. Elena sat across from him, her normally perfect posture showing signs of fatigue. after their late-night discoveries. Both our names, she said, tapping the documents. Joint guardianship. It's unusual, but my lawyers assure me it's possible. Hope lay in her bassinet between them, recently fed and content. The wooden rattle Thomas had made her was clutched firmly in one tiny fist. Carmen had gone home an hour ago, but not before, cooking enough food to last them days. It's more than guardianship, Thomas said, studying the papers. This makes us legally responsible for her safety, for her future. Yes. Elena's finger traced the edge of the papers. And it makes us visible. The people Catherine is fighting, they'll know exactly where Hope is, which might be exactly what Catherine wants. Sarah spoke from her position by the window, where she'd been watching the street. Think about it. Hope's safer in the spotlight than in shadows. These people operate in darkness. Thomas picked up Catherine's note again. Trust the guardians, she'd written. But most of those guardians were gone now, scattered or dead over the years. Martha had been one of the last. We'll need to rebuild the network, Elena said, reading his thoughts. Find new guardians, trustworthy people. Like Sarah? Thomas asked quietly. Officer Martinez turned from the window, surprise crossing her face. Eleanor studied her thoughtfully, then removed one of the silver medallions from her purse. Catherine chose this place, this town, for a reason, Elena said, not just because of Thomas and Martha's connection, but because she saw something here. Community. People who care. Sarah approached the table slowly. You're talking about more than just protecting Hope. Yes. Elena set the medallion on the table. Richard's network didn't just hide people. It helped them build new lives, found them homes, jobs, support systems. The churches were only part of it. And now you want to restart it, Sarah said, right here in Millbrook. Catherine's message was clear. The threat isn't over. People still need help. Elena touched Hope's tiny hand. My granddaughter needs more than just protection. She needs a community that understands what she represents. Thomas thought of all the empty rooms in St. Michael's, the unused spaces that could be renovated. The skills he'd learned in his years of craftsmanship that could be taught to others needing a fresh start. Martha would have liked that, he said softly, using the church for its true purpose again. Sanctuary. Sarah picked up the medallion, studying the image of St. Michael. The department would need to be involved, at least unofficially. Chief Jenkins is retiring next month. His replacement will need to be someone who understands the importance of community policing, Eleanor finished with a slight smile. Someone with experience protecting the vulnerable. Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. You've been planning this since you arrived. Catherine chose well when she chose Millbrook. Eleanor pulled another folder from her briefcase. These are the renovation plans for St. Michael's, a community center in the basement, training rooms, living quarters. All perfectly legal and above board. Hidden in plain sight, Thomas murmured. Exactly. Elena's expression softened as she looked at Hope. My granddaughter will grow up surrounded by people dedicated to helping others. What better legacy could we give her? Hope chose that moment to wave her rattle, making the soft wooden beads inside click together. The sound seemed to break the tension in the room. Thomas picked up his pen. Martha always said I was too cautious, too hesitant to take chances. He signed his name with a steady hand. She was right. Elena added her signature next to his. Sarah held the medallion to the light, then slipped it into her pocket. I'll need to think about how to structure this. Build the right team. Take your time, Elena said. We'll need to move carefully. But first, she stood and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the sun was rising over Millbrook, painting the church spire in morning gold. First, we have a baptism to plan. Hope deserves a proper welcome to her new family. Thomas lifted Hope from her bassinet, breathing in her sweet baby scent. And what a family it will be. St. Michael's transformed over the next 2 weeks. Construction crews worked efficiently under Elena's direction, while somehow managing to preserve the church's peaceful atmosphere. Thomas supervised the restoration of the original woodwork, his craftsman's eye ensuring every detail was perfect. The baptismal font, hidden under dust cloths for years, now gleamed in the morning light. Thomas had spent 3 days restoring it, working with the same patience he'd once devoted to fine jewelry. The silver surface reflected the newly cleaned, stained glass windows, sending ripples of colored light across the water's surface. "It's beautiful," Carmen said, adjusting Hope's christening gown, handmade by the women's sewing circle that had spontaneously formed after Hope's arrival. "Like it's brand new again." Hope, now 6 weeks old by their best estimate, watched the proceedings with her usual solemn expression. The gown's delicate lace framed her face, making her look like an old-fashioned painting come to life. Eleanor entered through the side door, elegant in a simple blue dress. She'd been different since signing the guardianship papers, softer somehow, though no less formidable. "The guests are arriving," she announced. "Sarah has everything under control outside." The media attention had died down, but they'd still needed to be careful with the invitation list. Each guest had been personally vetted by Sarah, who took her new role as guardian in training with characteristic thoroughness. "The bishop's here," Elena continued. "He's very interested in our plans for the community center." She smiled slightly. "Especially after that generous donation for the diocese youth programs." Thomas recognized Elena's strategic maneuvering, building allies, ensuring support for their larger mission. But today wasn't about networks or secrets. Today was about hope. The church filled quietly. Thomas recognized faces from town. The baker who brought fresh bread every morning, the librarian who'd donated children's books, the retired carpenter who'd helped him restore the pews. Each person had, in their own way, become part of Hope's extended family. Sarah stood at the back, wearing her dress uniform, the silver medallion now officially designated as a special community service commendation. 2 of her most trusted officers flanked the doors, their presence reassuring rather than intrusive. As the bishop began the service, Thomas held Hope. Eleanor stood beside him as godmother, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The morning light streamed through the windows Catherine had chosen as her daughter's sanctuary, and Thomas felt Martha's presence in every restored corner of the church. "Hope Elizabeth Wheeler Morgan," the bishop intoned, his voice carrying to the rafters. They'd chosen the name carefully. Elizabeth for Elena's mother, Wheeler Morgan to honor both families that would guard her future. The water touched Hope's forehead, and she did something remarkable. She laughed. The sound echoed in the sacred space, pure and joyful, bringing smiles to every face. "Welcome to the family of God," the bishop said, "and to this community of faith." Thomas knew he meant more than just the church community. In the past 2 weeks, Elena's lawyers had quietly helped 3 families establish new lives in Millbrook. Sarah had recruited 2 more officers into their confidence. The network was growing, carefully and naturally, just as Richard Morgan had envisioned. After the ceremony, as summer light filled the restored nave, the town gathered for a celebration. Tables groaned with home-cooked food, children played in the newly landscaped churchyard, and hope was passed from loving arms to loving arms. "She's going to have quite a story to tell one day," Carmen observed, watching Hope charm yet another admirer. "Yes," Thomas agreed, "but she'll also have quite a purpose." He touched the smooth wood of the pew beside him, thinking of all the work still to come. The sanctuary they were building wouldn't just protect Hope, it would continue her mother's work, her grandfather's legacy. Eleanor joined them, accepting a cup of punch from Carmen. "To new beginnings," she said softly, raising her glass. "And old traditions," Thomas added, thinking of Martha's secret work, now carried forward into the light. Hope's laugh rang out again, bright as church bells, calling them to witness love's simple triumph over fear. In that moment, Thomas knew, with certainty, that Catherine had chosen well. Her daughter would grow up surrounded not just by protection, but by purpose. The anonymous letter arrived exactly 1 month after Hope's baptism. Thomas found it slipped under the church door during his morning cleaning routine. A plain white envelope with no markings, Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper, the type he remembered from his jewelry days, the kind used for personal stationery by people who measured wealth in billions. "Stop digging into the past," the message read. "Some graves should stay buried. The child is safe. Leave it at that." At the bottom was a symbol that made Thomas's blood run cold, a tiny angel, identical to the ones in the church registry, but inverted. A fallen angel. He called Elena immediately. She arrived within minutes, her driver breaking more than a few speed limits. Sarah wasn't far behind, bringing the registry from its new secure location in the police station safe. "Here," Sarah said, pointing to an entry from 30 years ago. The inverted angel appears only once, next to a confirmation that was later crossed out. Elena studied the mark. Richard never mentioned this. But then there was so much he kept from me. To protect me, he always said. "The paper's Crane and Co., Thomas added. "Custom weight, probably special order. Only a few companies in the country use this specific grade." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Jewelry business taught you about paper? You learned to notice details in my line of work. High-end clients expect perfection in everything, down to the wrapping." He held the letter to the light. "This is the kind of paper Morgan Enterprises used for their executive communications. I'd recognize it anywhere." Eleanor's face hardened. "Someone from the old board. Most of them are gone, but a few managed to retire quietly before I could force them out." "Whoever it is, they know about the network," Sarah said, "about the Guardians. And they know we're rebuilding it." Hope's cry echoed from upstairs, where Carmen was watching her in the newly renovated nursery. Thomas moved instinctively toward the sound, but Elena caught his arm. "Wait," she said, pulling out her phone. "There's something you need to see first." She pulled up a news article from that morning. This just broke in the international press. The headline read, "Mass Resignation at Global Tech Firm Amid Trafficking Allegations." Below was a photo of a corporate tower in Singapore. "One of our old subsidiaries," Eleanor explained. "Catherine's been busy. 3 board members were arrested this morning. They were part of the original network Richard discovered. And now someone's warning us off," Sarah mused. "Because we're getting too close to something here in Millbrook." "Or someone," Thomas added, thinking of the registry entries. All those names, all those secrets. Hope cried again, more insistently. This time Thomas did go upstairs, returning with her cradled against his shoulder. She was wearing the yellow dress Carmen had made her, tiny fingers clutching her wooden rattle. Elena watched them with a mixture of love and worry. "We knew this might happen. Catherine's getting closer to exposing everything. They'll try to use Hope to stop her." "Let them try," Sarah said quietly, touching the medallion at her throat. 2 more officers in her department now wore similar medals. The network was growing, stronger every day. Thomas bounced Hope gently, breathing in her baby powder scent. "Martha used to say that evil thrives in darkness, that bringing things into the light was an act of faith." "Speaking of light," Elena said, "the contractor finished the security lighting yesterday. Full coverage of the grounds, backup generators, everything automated." She managed a small smile. "Hidden in the restoration work, just like everything else." Sarah's radio crackled. "Chief, you need to see this. Got a visitor at the station. Says he knew Richard Morgan." They all looked at each other. "Could be a trap," Sarah said. "Or it could be help," Eleanor countered. "Richard had allies we never knew about. People who've been waiting for the right moment." Thomas looked down at Hope, now contentedly playing with his shirt button. So much responsibility for such a tiny person. So many people willing to protect her, to carry on the work her mother and grandfather had started. "We knew this peace wouldn't last forever," he said finally. "Martha's journals, the ones we found hidden in the registry, they talked about cycles. How every few years the past would surface and the Guardians would have to stand firm." "Then we stand firm," Elena said, steel in her voice. "Together." Hope chose that moment to drop her rattle. The sound of wood on stone echoed through. the church like a warning bell, calling them to action once again. The security upgrades transformed St. Michael's in subtle ways. Thomas had insisted that any changes preserve the church's character as a sanctuary, not a fortress. Elena's team of experts rose to the challenge, weaving protection into the restoration work like golden threads in an ancient tapestry. "See here," the lead technician explained, showing Thomas the new lighting system. Motion sensors hidden in the restored woodwork, cameras disguised as original fixtures, everything runs through a dedicated secure server in the basement. Thomas ran his hands over the carved panels he'd helped restore. His craftsman's eye could barely detect the modifications. And the windows? Bulletproof glass behind the stained glass. Special UV coating preserves the original colors while providing protection. The technician smiled. Mrs. Morgan was very specific about maintaining authenticity. Elena herself oversaw the installation of the panic room, hidden behind the old confessional. A safe space within a safe space, she called it. The heavy door looked like original woodwork, its modern locking mechanism concealed by intricate carvings Thomas had created. Sarah brought her own expertise to the project. "We're integrating the church's security with the town's emergency response system," she explained during one of their daily meetings. "Any alarm here gets an immediate police response. I've handpicked the officers who'll have this rotation." But it was Carmen who thought of the details that made security feel like safety rather than imprisonment. She installed window boxes full of flowers, their cheerful blooms hiding motion sensors. She organized a rotation of church volunteers, all carefully vetted to maintain a constant, peaceful presence. "A watch church is a protected church," she said, arranging roses beneath a camera disguised as a decorative sconce. "And this way it stays alive, keeps its soul." Thomas appreciated that most of all. The church remained open for services, for community events, for quiet prayer. The food bank in the basement expanded. A free medical clinic opened in the renovated parish hall. Elena's resources and Sarah's protection combined to create something remarkable, a place of both sanctuary and service. Hope thrived amid it all. At 4 months old, she was a happy, curious baby who seemed to bring out the best in everyone she met. Thomas had moved into the renovated caretaker's cottage behind the church, while Elena split her time between Millbrook and running her company's ongoing transformation. They were in the cottage's small garden, watching Hope practice rolling over on a blanket, when Sarah brought news of their mysterious visitor. "His name is Michael Chen," she said, accepting a glass of Carmen's lemonade. Former Morgan Enterprises security chief, retired 20 years ago. He was there when Richard first discovered the trafficking network. Eleanor set down her glass carefully. "I remember him. Richard trusted him completely, but he disappeared right after Catherine did. I always wondered." "He was helping her," Sarah confirmed. "Part of the original escape plan. He's been underground all this time, working with others who got out. And now he wants to come in from the cold," Thomas finished. "Yes, but he's not alone. He's got files, evidence, names. And he says Catherine's ready to move. The arrests in Singapore were just the beginning." Hope squealed happily, managing to flip herself over. They all applauded automatically, the business of safety momentarily overtaken by simple joy. "We'll need to be ready," Eleanor said, watching her granddaughter with fierce love. "If Catherine's making her final move, they'll try to stop her here. Use Hope as leverage." Thomas picked up his latest creation, a set of wooden blocks, each face carved with symbols from the Guardian's code. Hope immediately reached for them, drawn to their smooth surfaces and gentle colors. "Then we'll be ready," he said firmly. "The Guardians protected Catherine when she was young. Now we protect her daughter while she finishes what Richard started." Sarah touched her medallion. "I'll talk to Chen myself. Verify everything. If he's genuine, he'll join our network," Elena finished. "Help us strengthen what we're building here." Hope stacked 2 blocks together, concentrating intensely. The afternoon sun caught the silver medallion now permanently fixed above the church's door, a sign to those who knew where to look that sanctuary could be found here. Thomas watched his adopted granddaughter play, surrounded by people dedicated to her safety. The past might cast long shadows, but they had built something stronger than fear here, something that would last. Martha would have approved, he thought, of all of it. Michael Chen arrived at St. Michael's on a quiet Tuesday morning, carrying a weathered leather briefcase that had seen multiple continents. He was smaller than Thomas had expected, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance, but Thomas recognized the watchful alertness in his eyes, the same look Sarah had when assessing potential threats. They gathered in the newly secured basement room. Thomas, Eleanor, Sarah, Carmen, and Chen. Hope was upstairs with one of Sarah's most trusted officers, but they could hear her occasional happy squeals through the baby monitor. Catherine wanted you to have these, Chen said, opening his briefcase. She said the time was right. He withdrew a USB drive and a stack of DNA test results. First, confirmation of what you already know. Hope is Catherine's daughter, but there's more. Elena took the papers with trembling hands. Tell us everything, she said quietly. From the beginning. Chen nodded, removing his glasses to clean them, a gesture Thomas suspected was more about gathering thoughts than improving vision. When Richard discovered the trafficking network, he didn't just find evidence of criminal activity. He found proof that it reached into governments, international agencies, organizations meant to protect the vulnerable. Chen's voice was soft but clear. They weren't just moving people against their will. They were using Morgan Enterprises technology to create new identities, hide money trails, make people disappear. Or appear, Sarah added, understanding, dawning. They could create paper trails, backgrounds, entire lives. Yes, Richard was gathering evidence, building a case carefully, but someone was warned. Chen looked at Elena. The night of the car accident, Catherine was supposed to be with him. Elena's hands clenched on the papers. What? He was taking her to a safe house. She knew too much already, but she was running late. Debate team practice went long. She wasn't in the car when... Chen paused. When they killed him. Thomas thought of 16-year-old Catherine, coming home to news of her father's death, carrying the weight of knowing it should have been her, too. She didn't run away immediately, Chen continued. She spent months secretly copying her father's files, following his leads, making connections. The moonstone pendant wasn't just jewelry. It contained a hidden drive with everything Richard had discovered. That's why she took it, Elena whispered. All this time, she's been carrying his evidence, building on it, creating her own network of investigators, witnesses, survivors. The Guardians helped at first, but as they aged or died, she had to find new allies. Chen smiled slightly. She's her father's daughter, and her mother's. Brilliant, methodical, unstoppable. He pulled more papers from his briefcase. Photographs, documents, bank records. 25 years of investigation laid bare on the table. 3 months ago, she confirmed the final connection. The head of the entire operation, someone who's been hiding in plain sight, using Morgan Enterprises' old technology to appear legitimate. Chen spread out surveillance photos. James Lancaster. Sarah leaned forward. The philanthropist. The one who runs all those children's charities. A perfect cover, Eleanor said bitterly. Who would suspect someone supposedly dedicated to helping children? Catherine's been working with international law enforcement for months, coordinating simultaneous raids worldwide. The Singapore arrests were just the start. Chen checked his watch. Right now, similar operations are happening in 12 countries. Within 24 hours, the entire network will be exposed. And Lancaster? Thomas asked. He'll be arrested tomorrow morning unless... Chen hesitated. Unless he tries to use hope as leverage, Elena finished. That's why Catherine sent her here. She knew they'd figure out the connection eventually, try to stop the arrests. Yes. She needed hope somewhere safe, protected, but also somewhere public enough that they couldn't simply make her disappear. Chen looked around the renovated basement. She chose well. When? Elena's voice cracked. When will we see her? Soon. Once Lancaster is in custody, once the evidence is public, she'll come home. Chen smiled properly for the first time. She's looking forward to meeting her daughter. Above them, Hope laughed at something, the sound carrying clearly through the monitor. They all looked up instinctively, then at each other. 24 hours, Sarah said professionally. We can handle that. The church is secure, Thomas added, and the town will help protect her. He thought of all the people who'd embraced Hope, become part of their extended family. Lancaster won't find any allies here. No, Elena agreed, steel in her voice. He won't. She gathered the evidence carefully. It's time to finish what Richard started, what Catherine continued, for Hope, for all the children Lancaster claimed to help. Chen closed his briefcase. Catherine said you'd say that. She said to tell you, she's proud of you, all of you. Through the monitor, Hope began to sing to herself, a wordless baby melody that filled the serious room with innocent joy, the sound of future happiness, made possible by past sacrifice. They came at midnight just as Sarah had predicted. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, approaching St. Michael's from different directions. But Millbrook was ready. Police cruisers quietly blocked off surrounding streets. Trusted neighbors kept watch from darkened windows. The church itself waited, its new security systems armed and alert. Thomas sat in the hidden panic room with Hope, who slept peacefully in her carrier. Elena stood at his side, while Carmen monitored the security feeds Chen had installed. Sarah coordinated with her officers from the church office, her voice calm and professional over the radio. Target vehicle approaching west entrance, she reported. 2 men, business suits. Lancaster confirmed in the back seat. Through the cameras, Thomas watched James Lancaster emerge from his SUV. He looked exactly like his charity photos, distinguished, grandfatherly, expertly groomed. Only his eyes, cold and hard in the security footage, revealed his true nature. Remember, Sarah's voice crackled, we need to delay them 15 minutes. That's when the international arrests begin. Lancaster reached the church steps, 2 bodyguards flanking him. He touched the silver medallion mounted above the door, a deliberate mockery of its meaning. Mr. Wheeler, he called out, his voice carrying through the empty church. I believe you have something that belongs to Catherine Morgan. I'm here to ensure it's properly cared for. Thomas felt Elena stiffen beside him. On the baby monitor, they could hear Lancaster's footsteps echoing on the stone floor. We know about the raids, Lancaster continued. Very impressive, but ultimately futile unless all the evidence is presented. Evidence currently in Catherine's possession. He paused. How much is her daughter's safety worth to her, I wonder? Carmen's fingers flew over the security controls. All exterior exits sealed. Sarah's team is in position. Through the monitor, they heard Lancaster sigh. Mr. Wheeler, Ms. Morgan, this building may be wired like a fortress, but we have all night. And I have friends in many places. How long can you really keep the child hidden? Eleanor pressed a button on her phone. Lancaster's voice cut off mid-sentence as all the church lights blazed to life. On the security feed, he shielded his eyes. Momentarily startled. Long enough, Elena's voice boomed through the church's speaker system. Long enough for the world to see exactly who you are. Lancaster recovered quickly, straightening his tie. My dear Elena, still trying to finish Richard's work? How did that end for him, I wonder? But Elena was smiling now, watching the security feeds. You should check your phone, James. Breaking news waits for no one. They saw Lancaster pull out his phone, saw his face change as he read the headlines now flooding international media. Jen's evidence, carefully leaked to trusted journalists worldwide, was breaking simultaneously across every major news outlet. Impossible, Lancaster whispered. The servers were secure. Richard's servers, Elena corrected. My husband's. Technology. Did you really think Catherine hadn't found every back door? Lancaster's controlled facade cracked. He gestured to his men. "Get that baby, now!" But Thomas had spent months learning his church's new architecture. As Lancaster's men moved forward, he pressed a sequence of hidden switches. Ancient hymns began booming through the sound system, while strobing security lights turned the nave into a disorienting maze of shadows. Through the chaos, Sarah's team moved with practiced precision. Years of small-town policing had taught them to work as one unit. Within minutes, Lancaster's men were disarmed and restrained. Lancaster himself stood alone now, his grandfatherly mask completely gone. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. I have contacts everywhere." "Had contacts." Catherine Morgan's voice cut through the church. She stepped out of the confessional, where she'd been hidden since sunset. "They're all being arrested right now. Hello, Mother, Thomas. I think it's time I met my daughter." Thomas heard Eleanor's soft gasp. Catherine was older, her face lined with years of hidden struggle, but her eyes were the same ones that gazed out from Hope's tiny face. Lancaster moved with surprising speed, reaching for a concealed weapon, but he'd forgotten about Carmen, who'd slipped up behind him while everyone watched Catherine. The taser she'd borrowed from Sarah dropped him before his hand reached his jacket. "Not in my church," Carmen said firmly, standing over his unconscious form. "There are children present." Through it all, Hope had slept soundly, protected by those who loved her. As Sarah's officers led Lancaster away, Catherine approached the panic room. Thomas opened the door to find Elena already rushing forward to embrace her long-lost daughter. "I'm sorry," Catherine whispered. "So sorry it took so long." "You're here now," Eleanor said simply. "You're both here now." Dawn broke over St. Michael's, painting the sky in colours that seemed brighter somehow, as if reflecting the lightness in everyone's hearts. The last police cars had departed hours ago, Lancaster and his men secure in federal custody. Now the church was quiet again, but with a peace that felt earned rather than borrowed. Catherine sat in Thomas's cottage, Hope cradled in her arms. She couldn't seem to stop touching her daughter's face, tracing the features she'd had to memorize from photographs during their separation. "She has Richard's chin," Elena observed, sitting close enough that her shoulder touched her daughter's. "Strong, like both of you. And your smile," Catherine added as Hope beamed up at her. "I saw it in every picture Thomas and Carmen sent. Those photos kept me going these last months." Thomas busied himself in the kitchen, preparing tea the way Martha had taught him. Careful, deliberate, a ceremony of care. Carmen had gone home to rest, but not before extracting promises from everyone to come for dinner later. "The family tree document arrived this morning," Elena said, pulling out an official-looking paper. "Hope Elizabeth Wheeler Morgan, with all of us listed as legal family, Catherine as mother, of course, Thomas and I as grandparents, even Carmen as honorary grandmother. A proper family," Thomas said, setting down the tea tray. "Martha would have loved this." Catherine accepted a cup, still holding Hope with her free arm. "Tell me about her, about Martha. Father trusted her so much, but I never really knew her." "She was like you," Thomas said softly. "Saw what needed doing and did it no matter the cost. Those years she spent helping people escape. She never complained, never sought recognition, just did what was right. Like you've done with Hope," Catherine said. "Both of you. Keeping her safe, giving her a real home, a community that loves her." She kissed her daughter's forehead. "I knew this was the right place. When I found the records of Father's Guardian Network, saw the connection to St. Michael's and the Wheelers, it felt like he was still helping us. Even now," Elena touched the silver medallion she now wore openly. "Richard's legacy lives. On the network you built, the evidence you gathered. It's already making a difference. Lancaster's arrest was just the beginning." 7 countries so far," Catherine confirmed. "Hundreds of survivors being helped, and now we can do it openly, legally. Morgan Enterprises' resources used the way Father intended, to protect people, not harm them." Hope reached for Thomas's hand, her tiny fingers wrapping around his weathered ones. He'd been making her a new toy, a set of nesting dolls painted with guardian angels. The largest one sat unfinished on his workbench. "Will you stay?" he asked Catherine. "Here in Millbrook?" She looked around the cottage, at the life Thomas and Elena had built for Hope. "Yes," she said firmly. "No more running. Hope deserves." "Roots, family, this amazing community you've created," she smiled. "Besides, someone needs to help run the foundation." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Foundation?" "The St. Michael's Foundation for Children's Protection. I filed the paperwork last week. A legitimate organization to continue the Guardian Network's work with proper funding and support." Catherine's eyes sparkled. "I thought you might help." "Manage it, Mother. And Thomas, we'll need someone to oversee the renovation of other churches as sanctuary spaces." "Sarah will want to be involved," Thomas said. "She's already training other police departments on community protection programs." "Carmen too," Elena added. "She's practically running the medical clinic already." Hope laughed suddenly, a bright sound that made them all smile. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling people to morning service. Through the cottage windows, they could see Millbrook residents walking up the path, many wearing silver medallions that caught the morning light. "A family," Catherine said wonderingly, watching the community gather. "A real family, bigger than I ever imagined." Thomas thought of Martha, of Richard Morgan, of all the guardians who had protected others through the years. Their work would continue, but in the light now, not the shadows. Elena stood, straightening her jacket. "Shall we? The congregation will want to meet Hope's mother." Catherine rose carefully, still holding her daughter. "Will you walk with us? Thomas, as family?" He picked up Hope's favorite rattle, the first toy he'd made her, worn smooth now from constant use. "Always," he said simply, and together they stepped out into the morning light. 1 year later, St. Michael's courtyard bloomed with roses. Carmen's garden had expanded, each carefully tended flowerbed hiding state-of-the-art security sensors. Children played on new equipment while their parents attended support group meetings in the renovated parish hall. The basement clinic served a steady stream of patients, many wearing silver medallions that marked them as survivors of Lancaster's network. Thomas sat on his favorite bench, watching Hope toddle between the flower beds. At 18 months, she was a force of nature, curious about everything. Catherine hovered nearby, never quite getting over her protective instinct, while Elena supervised from the shade of an old oak tree. "Foundation papers are ready," Sarah announced, joining them with a thick folder. She'd been promoted to chief of police 6 months ago, her community protection program becoming a model for departments nationwide. 3 more churches ready to join the network. Thomas nodded, thinking of the other St. Michael's churches they'd restored across the country, each one a sanctuary, each offering hope and healing to those who needed it most. The wooden crosses he carved for each location had become a symbol of safety, as recognized as the silver medallions. "The trust fund is secured too," Elena added. She'd transformed Morgan Enterprises into something Richard would have been proud of, a force for good in the world. "Every sanctuary will have permanent funding, and Hope's future is protected." "Speaking of Hope's future," Catherine called out, chasing after her daughter, who had discovered a new flower. "We need to finish planning her birthday party. Half the town wants to attend." Thomas smiled, remembering the quiet church he'd once tended alone. Now it pulsed with life and purpose. The renovated caretaker's cottage had expanded into a proper home, with rooms for both Catherine and Elena when they weren't traveling for foundation work. Carmen had her own office in the clinic, though she spent most of her time training new volunteers. "Thomas?" Hope's small voice drew his attention. She stood before him, offering a slightly squashed daisy. "For you." He accepted the flower solemnly. "Thank you, little one." Her vocabulary grew daily, each word a small miracle. Catherine scooped her up before she could dash off again. "Time for lunch, I think. Carmen's made her special soup." They gathered in the cottage's expanded kitchen, now the heart of their unusual family. Photos covered the walls, Hope's first steps, the foundation's opening ceremony, Sarah receiving her chief's badge, Carmen with her first class of medical volunteers, and in a special frame, the photograph of Martha that had once sat alone in Thomas's bedroom. "Uncle Chen called," Eleanor said as they ate. "The Singapore operation is fully functional. 20 families housed and protected already." Thomas watched Hope attempting to feed herself soup, Catherine patiently wiping her face. "Martha used to say that love multiplies when you share it. I never quite understood what she meant until now." "The Guardians understood," Sarah said. "That's why the network lasted so long, why it survived to help Catherine when she needed it. And now we guard others," Elena added. "Properly, legally, but with the same dedication." Hope banged her spoon on the table, accidentally creating a rhythm that made everyone laugh. She'd inherited Catherine's determination and Elena's grace, combined with something uniquely her own, a joy that seemed to lift everyone around her. Thomas touched the silver medallion he now wore openly. The Foundation's logo incorporated its design, St. Michael's sword transformed into a beacon of light. Every day, more people learned what it meant, came seeking help or offering it. "The contractors finished the new playground equipment," Catherine mentioned. "All the safety features hidden in plain sight, just like everything else." "Perfect timing," Sarah added. "We have 3 new families arriving next week, 5 children between them." Hope, as if sensing they were discussing children, perked up. "Play? Soon, sweetheart," Catherine promised. After lunch, Thomas watched his unlikely family, the billionaire, the police chief, the doctor, the survivor, and the child who had brought them all together, each of them carrying Richard Morgan's legacy forward in their own way, each adding to the Guardian's ancient mission of protection and hope. Through the window, he could see the church spire rising against the summer sky, no longer abandoned, no longer simply historic. Now it stood as a beacon, its renovated bells ringing out welcome and safety to all who needed it. Hope climbed into his lap, smelling of sunshine and Carmen's soup. "Story?" she asked hopefully. "Yes," Thomas said, holding his granddaughter close. "I'll tell you a story about angels who watch over children, about brave people who help others, about family that grows stronger with every heart it welcomes." "Your story," Elena added softly. "All of our stories." Hope's second birthday dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn morning that made St. Michael's stained glass windows glow like jewels. Thomas stood in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on her gift. A dollhouse crafted as an exact miniature of the church, complete with tiny silver medallions hidden throughout for her to find. The photo album on his bench lay open to a picture from the day he'd found her in the bell tower. Beside it, more recent photos showed the journey. Hope's first steps in the garden, Catherine reading her bedtime stories, Elena teaching her to plant flowers with Carmen, Sarah letting her wear her police badge. "It's perfect," Catherine said. From the doorway, making him jump, she picked up one of the tiny medallions. "She'll love hunting for these, just like her mother." Thomas smiled, always searching for hidden truths. The church grounds were already filling with guests. The St. Michael's Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, with sanctuaries established in 12 countries. Many of the visitors wore silver medallions, survivors, supporters, new guardians carrying the mission forward. Carmen had outdone herself with the decorations. Each table held a centerpiece featuring one of Hope's favorite wooden toys that Thomas had made throughout the year. The cake, designed by the local baker whose sister they'd helped escape an abusive situation, was shaped like a stack of children's books. "Remember the day we signed the guardianship papers?" Elena asked, joining them with Hope in her arms. The toddler wore a dress patterned with tiny guardian angels, another of Carmen's creations. "Seems like yesterday and forever ago," Thomas mused. "Hard to believe how much has changed." Sarah arrived in her dress uniform, leading a group of Foundation workers who'd flown in from the Singapore sanctuary. "Chen sends his love," she told Catherine. "He's overseeing the opening of the new Tokyo location." Hope squirmed to be put down, immediately running to the dollhouse. "Church!" she exclaimed, peering through the tiny windows. "Look, Mama!" They watched her discover the first hidden medallion, her face lighting up with triumph. Catherine caught her mother's eye, both remembering another little girl who loved solving puzzles. "Found you something too," Thomas told Catherine, reaching into his workbench drawer. He withdrew a silver medallion, different from the others. When she turned, "Idova," she gasped. The inscription read, "Protected by angels, guided by love, strengthened by family." "It was Martha's," he explained. "Found it in her journals last week. She'd kept it all these years, waiting for the right guardian." Catherine hugged him fiercely, then went to help Hope, who was calling for her to see another discovery in the bed. Dollhouse. The party moved outside as more guests arrived. Children played on equipment designed to look ordinary while providing top-level security. Parents chatted with foundation workers, sharing stories of healing and hope. The church bells rang out, no longer calling people to worship but celebrating life itself. Carmen appeared with Hope's favorite lunch, tiny sandwiches cut into angel shapes. "Martha would have loved this," she told Thomas. "All of it. The foundation, the families we help, this beautiful child." "She knew," Thomas said quietly, "something she wrote in her journal. She knew the church would be needed again someday. That's why she taught me to care for it, to keep it ready." Hope ran past, chasing bubbles that Elena was blowing. Her laugh echoed off the old stones, making everyone smile. Catherine watched from the garden, her own face reflecting the joy she'd missed in those years of hiding. Sarah joined them, off duty now, relaxed. "Just got word. The Tokyo Sanctuary opens tomorrow. 3 families already waiting for help." "The work goes on," Eleanor said, coming over with Hope, who was ready for cake. "But not in shadows anymore," Catherine added. "In the light, where hope can grow." Thomas looked at his family, all of them. Blood and chosen old friends and new allies. He thought of that morning in the bell tower, how one small cry had changed so many lives, how love, like light through stained glass, could transform ordinary things into something beautiful. Hope tugged his hand. "Grandpa, cake time!" "Yes, little one," he said, lifting her up. "Time to celebrate." The cake's candles cast a warm glow on Hope's face as they all gathered round. She was too young to understand the legacy she carried, the network of protection and love that had brought her safely to this moment. But she knew she was cherished, and really, Thomas thought, that was the greatest gift the Guardians had ever given. "Make a wish," Catherine whispered. Hope blew out her candles as the church bells rang, their sound carrying across the town, calling others to share in their joy, their purpose, their endless hope.